Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Welcome on into Nashville's morning news. Donald Trump saying this yesterday about the jobs report, where the allegation is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the administration, trying to manipulate the market numbers or the job numbers, and somehow 818,000 jobs just vanished.
And it really isn't a revision. It's a total lie. Total lie. There's never been any revision like this. They wanted it to come out after the election, but somehow it got leaked. It got leaked. Government leaks, too.
That was former President Donald Trump. EJ Antoni is joining us live on the Newsmaker Hotline, a financial analyst. You've seen him on Fox Business, currently with the Heritage Foundation financial analyst. So I gotta ask you, EJ, a couple of things right off the bat. Was this actually leaked, or was this a revised report that was just released in the middle of the DNC?
Well, this was a scheduled release set long before they picked the dates for the DNC. But I think what the president might be referring to here is the fact that there was some kind of problem at the Bureau of Labor Statistics where it didn't actually get released on time. However, several major Wall Street banks were able to contact the Bureau of Labor Statistics and get the information over the phone, which is a total breach of protocol. The fact that several of those big makers and shakers had access to the information when the rest of the market didn't.
That's fascinating. All right. Well, I mean, moving on from that, U.S. economy, 818,000 fewer jobs from April 2023 through March of this year. And so this means that, of course, Joe Biden's unemployment rate is not nearly as good as he has been bragging. They haven't created the jobs and so on and so forth. How does this happen? Like, Trump says that the current president, Joe Biden, padding the numbers. Was this a mistake? Was this intentional? What do you think is going on here?
Well, it's really interesting, Dan. First of all, there's no evidence whatsoever that anything is being actively done to cook the books. However, there is plenty of evidence going all the way back to the spring of 2022, so over 2 years ago now, that there were problems with the statistical models being used at BLS, at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the fact that they have done nothing to correct it, that, I think, is where the scandal is, quite frankly. The Labor Department has to be aware that there have been problems. And again, they have done nothing to fix it. For month after month, we keep getting these blockbuster jobs reports that are only then later revised down. And that's why this is such a big deal. Not only is it a downward revision in this annual benchmark of over 800,000, but that's on top of those 12 months already having been revised down. So if you combine the previous revisions with these new ones, you're talking about losing 1.2 million jobs over a 12-month period. In other words, over a third of all the jobs we supposedly added never existed.
Well, and the other thing to think about, EJ, is that Joe Biden has constantly said that when he came into office, he was able to create, all of these jobs coming out of COVID, but those were bounce back jobs. Those were jobs, as Donald Trump has said, and we've all said, that those were jobs that were simply coming back after COVID shut them down. So it's like the entire job creation narrative that Joe Biden has had, it seems to be crashing right in the middle of the DNC.
Dan, I think that's a very fair assessment. And it's remarkable. It's frankly very remarkable how they can call it job growth when they make it illegal for you to go to work one day and then they kindly permit you to go back to work the next. And they somehow count that as a job created? Give me a break. And I think it's really interesting that, this is the second biggest of these downward revisions that we've ever had on the annual benchmark. The only time that was bigger was back in 2009. And the reason that one was so significant was because essentially the labor market was deteriorating so quickly as the economy bottomed out in the Great Recession that BLS had difficulty keeping up with current economic conditions, and their models and their methodologies no longer made sense in that environment. So a model, for example, that made perfect sense in 2005 didn't make any sense in 2009. And so they grossly overestimated jobs numbers. Today, they have assumptions built in that made sense back in 2019, let's say, but now 5 years later in a post-pandemic world make no sense at all, but they're still using them, hence the ridiculous overcounting of jobs.
EJ Antoni is with the Heritage Foundation financial analyst, our financial analyst here on WTN and Nashville's Morning News. So, EJ, you said that the modeling, how they count these supposedly created jobs, has been effectively busted for quite some time. You said something about the modeling and things that are built into the modeling. I don't understand this stuff. But when did these issues with the modeling come up? I don't remember these kinds of wide help me, EJ. What are they saying? The corrections. I don't remember these wide corrections under Donald Trump. It only seems to be something that is happening with Joe Biden.
Well, in the post-pandemic world, the economy really has changed pretty dramatically in some ways. And so, again, assumptions that you made before that made perfect sense just don't hold true anymore. And if you continue operating under those assumptions, well, now it's garbage in, garbage out. Right. I'll give you what I think is a very good example. You know, the BLS is constantly trying to estimate how many jobs are being created or lost when new firms are created or firms go out of business. And what happens is you need to know essentially how many firms are being created, how many firms are being lost, and you need to have some kind of sense of when that happens, what is the effect on the jobs market. That's something called the birth-death model. That has literally accounted for half of all the job gains this year. Well, that model is worth absolutely nothing these days because, again, in a post-pandemic world, the number of firms that are being created after a business application has been started is very, very low. In other words, startups are much less successful today, and even the firms that are successful, that do get off the ground, are employing far fewer people than they used to. So that's just one model. It's just one example of how the BLS continues to, again, grossly overstate jobs. And the reason I say that there's something scandalous here is because we knew back in the spring of 2022 there was a problem. And the fact that it has gone on for more than 2 years now, and it continues to be a problem. It wasn't just a speed bump. It wasn't just a blip on the radar. It continues to be a problem, and the Labor Department is doing nothing to fix it. That's why we continue to get garbage numbers.
Well, it's like the crime stats. I mean, the Democrats will say that, crime is down, but the reality is that the Biden administration changed the way that those stats are reported, and it is such an albatross. It's so difficult to report these numbers that these big blue cities just gave up. That's why the numbers look down. It's not because crime is actually going down. It's because these big blue cities and other places, it's too problematic to report those numbers. And so I guess at the end of the day, given the fact that these 818,000 jobs that Biden supposedly created, they have just evaporated in this correction. Ultimately, now what that means is that as far as Donald Trump goes, his unemployment rate, because you got to discount the last 2 years of Trump's administration because of COVID. So when you look at Trump's first 2 years before COVID, his unemployment rate was 3.5%. This means that Joe Biden's unemployment rate is 4.3%. End of the day, it looks like Donald Trump's, if you're fair, it looks like Donald Trump's unemployment rate is better those first 2 years before COVID than Joe Biden's 3.5 years in.
Well, the unemployment rate is a really tricky thing, Dan, and people need to understand the fact that it's a rate. In other words, it's a fraction. There's a numerator and a denominator. You have the top and the bottom there. And if you change either of those, you're going to change the overall number. And there are literally times when a higher unemployment rate is actually a sign of prosperity. And essentially that can happen when you have times like a booming economy where there's a huge increase in the demand for work, and people who were previously sitting on the sidelines, not in the labor market all of a sudden decide, wow, this is a really good time for me to go out and get a job. Pay is increasing, et cetera. And so they do that. And when they initially go out and look for a job, it adds to the number of people in the labor market who don't have a job and are looking for one, AKA they're unemployed. And so it can actually increase that unemployment rate. Now, obviously, it's going to come down over time. But what we've seen today is exactly the opposite. We have literally millions of Americans who left the labor force during COVID and never returned. Now, they don't have jobs today, but because they're not in the labor market, they're not counted as unemployed. So if we actually account for all of those missing Americans, there's a few different ways to do that, then you get an unemployment rate not of 4 point something percent, but somewhere between about 6.6 and 8.2%. Now, that's not horrific. That's not the Great Depression, but it is certainly well into recession territory.
Interesting. All right. Well, I wish we had more time with you. EJ Antoni, how can people find you on Twitter?
The handle there is @RealEJ Antoni.